Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 32 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Philadelphia Flyers, in which the Sharks have won 3-2 in overtime. The final game of 2021 for the San Jose Sharks, as they will not have another game before New Year's Eve tomorrow, and they managed to get the victory and finish off the year very well. It was in stark contrast to that pretty ugly game that they had just a couple of nights ago against the Arizona Coyotes, a game that also happened to go to overtime and even went to the shootout, which the Sharks still managed to get 2 points in. They obviously wanted to come out here against the Flyers and have a much better type of game, and that's exactly what ended up happening here. Even though this game ends up being a one-goal game that goes to overtime, they still give over that extra point. The Sharks look significantly better here tonight than they did against the Coyotes. In the first period, it would be the Flyers scoring the only goal of that first 20 minutes. That would be Morgan Frost making it 1-0 Flyers, which would be the score after 20 minutes, but it cannot really be disputed that the Sharks were the better team throughout that first period, got some chances, but they ended up kind of missing the net on a lot of those opportunities, and that was kind of the big story here tonight in my eyes. You can take a look at this game from a Sharks fan perspective that had over 40 shots in this one and say, well, the Flyers were starting a rookie goaltender, Felix Sandstrom, his first career game, and he just stands on his head and completely denies the Sharks, and they just barely managed to score 3 goals and squeak out this victory. And yes, the Sharks were dominant throughout this game, but I think it's a bit unfair to say that the Flyers had to have their rookie goaltender completely stand on his head, because honestly, while the Sharks were peppering him with shots, there weren't a ton of dangerous opportunities, and the dangerous opportunities that did arise for the Sharks did not end up on net with a miraculous save, but would actually end up getting shot wide. That is not to say that there weren't any grade A opportunities that Sandstrom actually robbed the Sharks on. For instance, there was that one from Barabanov, a beautiful move in front of the net, but he gets robbed by Sandstrom. There were a couple of those opportunities, but all in all, I wouldn't say that this was a game that was just an absolute open season on the Flyers goaltender. He didn't have to make a ton of massive saves. He was good, but he didn't have to be fantastic. But in the end, that ends up being enough for the San Jose Sharks. Come second period, they managed to tie this one up on a shorthanded goal from Logan Couture. Then it would be pretty quickly after Brent Burns would score to take the lead for the San Jose Sharks 2-1, and that would be the score at the end of the second period. A second period in which once again the Sharks were extremely dominant and played exceptionally well. One of their better periods of the season, you could very well argue, and it looked like they'd be able to close this one out in the third period. And that the first 10-15 minutes of this third period, that's exactly the way it was going. 8 minutes in, they were out shooting the Flyers. I believe it was 10-1, but then the Sharks got into a bit of penalty trouble, took one penalty. Meyer went to the box, then Brent Burns went to the box just a few seconds into the Flyers power play, which led the Flyers getting a 5-on-3 for about 1 minute and 55 seconds, and the Sharks penalty kill came up huge for them in that moment, just killed it off superbly. Both Couture and Bonino in their respective singular forward shifts in that 5-on-3 defense played heroically and managed to clear the puck out of the zone a couple of times in just impossible opportunities, impossible positions, and the Flyers did not manage to get the game-tying goal then. However, in the last few minutes of the third period, they would get that game-tying goal. That would come from Farabee, and we'd head into the overtime tied at 2, but eventually this one did not go to shootout. It would be Tomas Hertl getting the overtime winner off of some interesting, I would say, patience displayed by Erik Karlsson on this 2-on-1. I was expecting this Karlsson pass to come a lot earlier, but he ends up waiting it out, and it seemed to catch the Flyers defenseman by surprise. Travis Sanheim didn't really expect this type of patience from Karlsson either, and he ends up feeding Tomas Hertl in the end to get that goal. So nice play by Karlsson, good stuff play by Tomas Hertl, and the Sharks get the 2 points. Moving on here, before I get into the lineup, there are a couple of things I want to talk about. The first is the Sharks power play, which was once again not managing to score a goal here tonight. I believe they had 4 power plays, and while they did manage to get a fair amount of shots, like I mentioned earlier, it was kind of a situation where, yes, there were shots on net, but not a ton of dangerous opportunities, I would say. A couple here or there, but not a ton. The Sharks power play, they do still need to get back on track, because there is an interesting stat that Randy Hahn did give here tonight, which was that the Sharks were dead last in terms of power play opportunities per game. As we already knew, the Sharks were not doing a very good job previously in this season, whether that's the referee's fault or the Sharks themselves. They were not doing a great job at drawing penalties. They managed to get 4 here tonight, which was much more than they usually get, and they couldn't convert on any of them, so that was a bit disappointing. But the second thing that I do want to talk about is Sharks coach Bob Booner. A couple of things here for him. The first is his handling of Timo Meier near the end of this game. So I mentioned that the Flyers managed to tie this one up from a Joel Farabee goal late in the third period that brought them into overtime. And it was on a rush through the neutral zone, sort of captained by Timo Meier. He gets past center ice, but then it's poked off of his stick. It goes the other way, and it ends up in the back of the Sharks' net. And this was a situation where, honestly, I don't really fault Timo Meier all that much. The Sharks had carried the puck through the neutral zone a dozens of times, honestly, throughout this game. And so it feels very much like a hindsight is 2020 type of situation where you say, well, Meier should have dumped the puck in that situation just because it so happened to be poked off his stick and ended up going the other way. But fine, whatever. Even though I would say that since the defensemen weren't changing, this was a situation where it probably shouldn't have ended up being a goal if not for James Reimer letting in a bit of a weak one. But if you're Bob Booner and you want to take this opportunity to send a message to your best player on the team by not playing him in a couple of those shifts at the end of the third period and instead having Jeff Viel fill in on the top line with Barabanov and Couture, sure, why not? But when you head into the overtime, if you're a team who's actually trying to make it to the playoffs, you cannot, under any circumstances, just under the sort of the guise of trying to send a message, you cannot bench your team's best player. The fact that the Sharks started the overtime with a duo of Couture and Matt Nieto instead of Couture and Timo Meier because you're upset with this sort of borderline bad play that he made near the end of the third period that somehow, not even his fault because Reimer lets in a weak goal, ends up in the back of your net. It's just kind of asinine in my eyes to penalize him in that way. It's not even that, like, if this was last year and Meier had been having a weak year and then he makes a play like that, okay, fine. But Meier has been your best player. He has carried your team through many games thus far this season, and then you come out and say, well, you know, let's send a message here. We don't really care about making the playoffs. Who cares if we don't actually end up getting this extra point? Let's send on consistently Matt Nieto and then also Noah Gregor in the overtime instead of Timo Meier. That just kind of drives me crazy. The second thing is his lineup choices made before this game actually started. So Jonathan Dahlen returns from the COVID protocol and he ends up getting inserted to the lineup here tonight. I don't have a problem with that, and surprisingly he ends up on the second line as Barabanov retained his spot on the top line with both Couture and Meier. What I do have a problem with is who Dahlen ends up replacing, and that is Helbegowatz. And it's not that Helbegowatz was moved down from the second line, even though he had been playing quite well with Hertl. He's actually removed from the lineup entirely. So for whatever reason, Bob Booner decides that Jeff Viel can stay in, Jonah Gadjevich can stay in, Noah Gregor can stay in, Lane Peterson can stay in, but Helbegowatz, who had been quite good for the San Jose Sharks in the 2 games that he had played in his NHL career, which were the last 2 games that the Sharks played, he ends up drawing out of the lineup. To me, I look at this and I see that Helbegowatz has had more offensive chances and has shown off more offensive skill in that brief sample size, those 2 games, than Gadjevich, Peterson, and Viel had shown off combined in their entire NHL careers. And that is probably an exaggeration, but sadly, it's not that big of an exaggeration. That's how sort of empty the games of Peterson, Viel, and Gadjevich. I mean, Viel hasn't really played much this season, but the other 2 have. That's how empty their games have been this season and how solid that Helbegowatz has been, and yet he ends up as a healthy scratch here tonight. I do not understand the reasoning behind that. But finally, moving on to the lineup, I'll try to make this a bit quick as I've kind of harped on Bob Booner's decision making a lot thus far here tonight. On the first line, Barabanov, Couture, and Meier I thought actually were a pretty solid line here. Logan Couture obviously had the heroic plays on that penalty kill, also made some very nice plays offensively. Barabanov as well. looked very, very good here tonight. Not consistently very, very good. I wouldn't say that every single shift he came on, he was just immensely dominant, but there were a few shifts here tonight where he was just the best player on the ice in those particular shifts. Just seemed to have a magnet for a stick, and the puck was, you know, a piece of metal that just seemed to be sticking to his stick at all times. He just happened to show off insane puck control. He looked like Connor McDavid out there at times. Just great game for Barabanov, absolutely. And even Timo Meier, even though with how the game ended, still looked rather solid throughout. When it comes to the second line, Dahlen, a bit of an adjustment as he returned to the lineup, just as it was when he had gotten injured a few weeks ago in the game against the Washington Capitals. Once he returned to the lineup, he also had a bit of a slow start trying to get back up to speed. That kind of happens here tonight. Dahlen didn't really do too much. Hertl, I thought, still had a very solid game, and I will say Gregor as well, even though I wouldn't have been so sad to see him get pushed out of the lineup when Dahlen came back instead of Helbegowicz. I did think that Gregor still had a pretty solid game here tonight. With the third line, Bonino, Nieto, Cogliano still playing rather solid. I thought Cogliano actually had a couple of very nice offensive plays here tonight, which was decently nice to see. And obviously, Nieto clearly played good enough to get some overtime time on ice, so I guess that's a good thing. And then when it comes to the fourth line here, obviously I talked bad about these three players a lot just a few minutes ago when I was talking about the Helbegowicz situation, but I will say that this fourth line did have a very solid game here tonight. In particular, Lane Peterson was the player who really stood out in a positive way for the San Jose Sharks on this fourth line. He set up a lot of opportunities. He even got some power play time, very little power play time, as the Sharks were kind of trying to load up with their first unit, and so the second unit didn't really get too many minutes. But even so, in that brief power play time he did have, he actually didn't look too bad. Had some decent offensive zone shifts, a bit of a lesser extent to both VL and Gadjevich, who were good, but not fantastic like Peterson was, at least in a relative sense. But still a decent game for the fourth line, though I still would have loved to see Helbegowicz in over one of those players. When it comes onto the defensive side of things, the other thing to talk about here would be Ferraro ends up actually joining the COVID protocol, and so Nick Milosh has to step in. And while the defensive pairings started out like Shemek and Burns as the first pairing, it actually ended up evolving to Shemek moving down to the third pairing with Milosh and Vlasic moving up to the first pairing with Burns. And unlike in the previous game against the Arizona Coyotes, where I talked about how none of those defensemen had a good game at all, here tonight I feel as though every single defenseman for the San Jose Sharks actually looked rather solid. Yes, there were a couple of misplays. The Flyers ended up with a couple of odd man rushes, and one of those ended up in the back of the net. You could say two of those, I guess, ended up in the back of the nets if you want to count the Farabee goal as an odd man rush, though kind of hard to say. However, besides a couple of misplays here or there from players like Burns, who maybe had a couple of mispositions, and same with Erik Karlsson, like it's going to happen every single night, otherwise I thought they played rather solidly, and it was a very impressive night for those six players. In particular, I would like to point out Jacob Middleton, who really recovered after an extremely rough night in the previous one against the Arizona Coyotes, and Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who actually took his, I guess you could call it, promotion to the first pairing with Brent Burns in stride a bit. I actually thought looked pretty solid here tonight. When it comes to the Sharks goaltender, James Reimer, I thought had a pretty solid night besides that Joel Farabee goal that he did let in. You know, if he doesn't let that one in, maybe the Sharks hold on. Maybe they leave the Flyers to just getting the full 0 points here tonight. But it doesn't really matter that the Flyers end up getting the 1 point, because the Sharks get the 2 points and the Flyers are an Eastern Conference team. So otherwise, Reimer does sort of end up having a pretty solid night for the San Jose Sharks, though still you'd like to see him clean up that bad goal that he did let in. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action in 2022 all the way next year. Going to be a very long time before we see the Sharks play again, where they will take on the Pittsburgh Penguins, an afternoon game as they head to the road. And the Penguins, they've had a kind of a rough start to the season, but they've definitely brought it back as of late. Crosby's looking like classic Crosby, and we'll see if the Sharks can handle Pittsburgh. Class dismissed.